as long as I can remember, there's always been individuals pitted against individuals, groups against groups, teams against teams, someone versus someone else, because it's always been that way. It was that way before Jesus was born. It was that way back in Genesis. It was Cain against Abel. It was Jacob against Esau. It was Christians against Jews. It was Christians and Jews against Muslims, or Hindus, or Buddhists. There was always that contention that existed. But in the beginning, there was no contention. There was only giving and serving and loving until sin raised its ugly head. In Matthew's version of the Christmas story, we introduce the wise men. The word coming out of the Greek translation is magi. And sadly, that word is most often associated with magic. But in this case, it refers to a group of scholars who study the stars. Was it astrology or was it astronomy? It's hard to say. But their presence in the biblical record is not a divine endorsement of astrology. Far be it. It's rather that God gave them a miraculous star to follow, a special sign that announced the birth of a king. And the star led them to Jerusalem, whereupon they received the message from God's prophets that told them that the king would be born in Bethlehem. They then followed the star to Bethlehem, and there they worshiped the Christ child. One very important detail needs to be upheld, however. The song that we sing, "We Three Kings of Orient Are," is not based on fact. It's based on an assumption. We assume that there were three kings there because three gifts were presented. That's not what the Bible teaches, however. We don't know how many kings were there. It doesn't say. It just says that there were three gifts given. We assume that each one gave a gift. Maybe, maybe not. We just don't know. But they did give these gifts. They gave these gifts and then they left, even though the puppet king, Herod, wanted them to come back to see him and tell him where they found this king of the Jews. Herod was afraid of this newborn king. He wanted to destroy him. He was called King Herod, or Herod the Great in some instances, because the Roman Senate had established him as the king. A Senate that was influenced by a fellow named Mark Antony. You ever heard of him? And a woman named Cleopatra? You remember what kind of mess they had? Well, the truth of the matter is Herod was a cruel and crafty man who permitted no one, not even his own family, to interfere with his rule or to prevent the satisfying of his own personal evil desires. He was a ruthless murderer. He had his own wife and her 2 brothers killed because he suspected them of treason. He was married at least 9 times in order to fulfill his lusts and strengthen his political ties. He was an operator. He operated mostly outside the lines rather than inside. He didn't need to have Jesus around. That he tried to kill him, as we learn if you read later on into this chapter, that all the male children in the area around Bethlehem were destroyed by him in an effort to get rid of Jesus, but they had escaped to Egypt. Herod alone wanted to bear the title of King of the Jews. He also wanted Jesus dead because Herod was not a full-blooded Jew. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Till I started preparing for this message, I did not know that Herod was not a Jew through and through. He was actually called an Idumean. I-D-U-M-A-E-A-N. A descendant of Esau. Remember what happened with Jacob and Esau? So this picture of the old struggle between Esau and Jacob that had begun, according to the scripture, even before the 2 boys were born, back in Genesis 25:19 through 34. It is the spiritual versus the carnal, the godly versus the worldly. It has always been, it is, and it shall be that way, because that's just the way of the world. And the only way that we can overcome this, the only way that we can be on the side of right and justice and mercy, if we look back upon not only the biblical record, but also the historical record, we have to be on the Lord's side. It's not always easy to do that. Over the past number of days, Clemmy and I were in some different places. Spent most of our time in Louisville, Kentucky. They have crime there just like we have here in Forest. They have accidents like we have here. People get hurt. People lose their lives. There's a lot of cancer up there. People are very busy trying to treat that. Then we moved over to Lexington, and the very same was true over there, involving probably just as great a percentage of people. You read about it in the newspaper, you hear about it on the television or the radio. All of these dynamics are still the same. You get pretty much the same reports about what's going on in Washington and other places around the world. You hear about the contentions going on in city government and state government and all those kinds of things. It's pretty much the same everywhere. But what it all boils down to is the spiritual versus the carnal and the godly versus the worldly. It's always there. It's always been there. But Jesus didn't bow down to this. He said, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, or give to the government the things that belong to them, but give to God the things that belong to God. The government doesn't own us. Doesn't even own our property. Thankfully, we still do. But in that instance, even, we don't really own property because we can't carry it with us when we leave here. We have to pass it on to somebody else. So we're only stewards of that while we're here, whether it's the church, for ever how many years you're the pastor of it, or a Sunday school class, for ever how many years you're the teacher of it, or the owner of 100 acres of land or 1,000 acres of land. If you own it for 100 years, you've done extraordinarily well. Most people don't make it that far. But we have to pay taxes. We have to keep it up. We have to do all these things because we live in a world with a government and with worldly influence and worldly effects. But if it weren't for God, there wouldn't be any land. There wouldn't be any trees. There wouldn't be any water. There wouldn't be any air to breathe. All those things are gifts from God. And someday He'll take all those things away and take people to places where those things don't matter anymore. So ultimately, this is what we're living for. We're ultimately living for the hereafter. It's important to enjoy it while we're here, to make the best of it, to get the most out of it, for the benefit of the highest number of people. It's important to love and to be loved, to give and to receive. But most importantly, it is to allow God to be God and to place ourselves in a position where we can really be His children, where we can really live in His influence, His domain, where we can receive the fullest appropriation of His gifts, His blessing, His peace, and His hope. And there's no better place to do that than at the altar when Holy Communion is given and received. Because God is here. God is among us. And God desires to be the dearest thing unto each of us, so that there is no versus between Him or us. May His peace come upon us. Join me on page 12 in your hymnal, please.